Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here and welcome to the talk. So let me entertain you for the next 36 minutes or so. My Croatian grandmother spoke to me in French. There is a specific kind of terror when something you're passionate about, something even existential to you, seems under threat on a scale you and the world have never seen before. The rise of large language models changes how we read and write, how language develops. A recent working paper estimated that more than half of all new books on Amazon now contain AI-generated text. Even more so, in 2026, AI writing has entered even the prestigious literature spaces, like, for example, the acclaimed Granta magazine, who controversially and unknowingly probably published a short story generated by AI. I'm a writer. Language is my passion, my living. Of course, I am concerned. But so should you. A job crusher, a fact twister, a slop maker, a privacy invader, a climate trasher, and a general pain in the neck. A new, remarkable technology has been rolled out in the most irresponsible and self-serving manner by the worst people for the worst reasons. It's not the machines, we should be angry with. Current debates speak about a new kind of fascism, techno-fascism. So here I am, working out what is currently happening, under the rise of technofascism to language. How does this affect our imagination? What does this have to do with European science fiction? What is European science fiction? Let's start with language. Language is a commons, a resource, produced collectively and shared collectively. No one owns language. Institutions attempted to regulate it through academies or even censorship. But living language, spoken, written, sung, improvised, always remained something made by those who used it. That has changed. Some call it the biggest intellectual property theft in human history, or even the death of intellectual property. Internal planning documents from Anthropic, the company behind the large language model Claude, described Project Panama as an effort to destructively scan all the books in the world. Millions of books were physically destroyed, their spines sliced off to feed the loose pages into the scanning machine. Large language models are trained on the output of human language, books, emails, Wikipedia arguments, scientific papers, and this collective archive is then broken down in tokens. Tokens are neither, units of meaning or syllables. In the English language, they're bits like ness or izations. And these tokens are then recombined statistically to predict the next word or phrase. And the result is a language that is so fluid, that in fact finding grammatical error or clunky syntax is nowadays a sign that you're looking at human prose. The language that comes out of the machine has a specific tone, a specific style. It is formally correct, and at the same time, it is undead. A language that functions rather than thinks. A zombie. Repetitions, empty phrases, cliches. This is its political form. Hannah Arendt had a word for this. Gedankenlosigkeit, thoughtlessness. She found it in the speech of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi who organized mass murder, and when asked to explain himself, could only reach for stock phrases and bureaucratic procedure. Thoughtlessness for Arendt is a failure of care and attention, not a lack of intelligence, but making no effort to think. And the symptoms are linguistic, the cliché, the repetition, everything that relieves us of the need to think, relieves us of the need to care. So with the concept of thoughtlessness, Hannah Arendt wanted to show how a certain style, a certain form is deeply connected to a lack of empathy. What Arendt saw as a moral catastrophe, Silicon Valley has turned into a subscription service. In 2026, a paper in AI and Society, describes the authoritarian tendencies shaped by digital technologies, corporate concentration, and the enclosure of commons as technofascism. In her book, The New Fascism, Entitlement and the Urge to Destroy, published in March 2026, philosopher Eva von Redeker notes that to have an understanding of fascism does not simply mean clearly acknowledging something terrible. It also means being able to explore the horrors of the present without exaggeration or one-sidedness, to locate something without it being fully developed. So what is this something in the case of technofascism? The concentration of data infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and political power in the hands of a small number of unaccountable people with no democratic mandate, explicitly hostile to regulation and advancing an ideological program. And you probably know who I am thinking of right now. George Orwell understood this shape of danger. In his novel 1984, the fictional language newspeak is a tool of political control. Reduce the vocabulary and you reduce what can be thought. What is happening at the moment is something subtler and maybe more total. A statistical regression towards the dominant, the most represented. The privatization of language, I would argue, follows the same structural logic as the privatization of whole cities, like Prospera in Honduras. Take something shared, something that belongs to everyone. Remove it from accountability, privatize it, then sell it back to us. Call it progress. Call it Utopia. When the democratic government of Honduras, a socialist government, repealed the law that enabled the private city Prospera, the free city Prospera, the investors sued. They sued for $10.7 billion, which is 2/3 of the country's annual budget. So that's what it costs to say no to someone else's utopia. In her 2026 book, Kybernetik und Kritik, Anna-Verena Nostov suggests that ideological critique now faces a new challenge. Spaces of possibility are prematurely closed by utopias and cybernetic paradises, by visions in which social problems are presumed to be already resolved through technical elegance, efficiency, or disruptive innovation alone. Under these circumstances, Nostov argues, ideological critique, must become now a critique of utopias. This includes, the techno-fascist science fiction at work, when Elon Musk talks about colonizing Mars, or Peter T. promotes projects like the Free City, private cities. Both are new forms of corporate colonialism. Both are blocking the very futures in which we could still slow down climate collapse. The same, I would argue, applies to the proposed utopia of large language models. Their data centers are burning for water, pumping out emissions, on a scale that so far has been hidden from us, as investigated in 2026 by Zeit Online. And the output, the AI language, stays with us like plastic waste. And like plastic waste, the next LLMs will have to choke on it. Large language models are sold to us as paradise. What is being claimed, however, is ownership of language itself. And Eva von Redeker calls this Phantombesitz, phantom ownership. The claim as of something as mine that was never legitimately owned in the first place. Fascism, she argues, is the brutal intensity in which people defend something as theirs, even though it never was. And she points out that phantom ownership is also the core logic of capitalism. The idea that bodies, nature, and now language can be owned and sold. So under the rise of technofascism, we are confronted with a new language, a language that sounds correct, professional, even reasonable. At the same time, it awaits care and responsibility. This is why I would argue that questions of style, aesthetics, sound, poetics are politically urgent right now. Confronted with faultless language, attention to style can become a form of resistance. Sound, syntax, poetics, these are political technologies, and science fiction has always known. Science fiction, also understood as speculative fiction, speculative feminism, social fiction, is often discussed in terms of ideas or world building. But for me, its deepest work happens at the level of language. One of my first encounters, with language and what it can do was in the novel A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, published in 1962. Its narrator, Alex, speaks in Nazard, a slang invented by Burgess, which draws on Russian and on the working class dialect, Cockney, and on pure invention. Reading the opening lines, you find yourself in a different world, in a different body. That's it going to be then, eh? There was me, that is Alex, and my three droogs, that is Pete, Georgie, and Dim. Dim being really dim, and we sat in the Corva milk bar, making up our resodocs what to do with the evening. A flip, dark, chill winter bastard, though dry. The story of violence and state power is told through a language that is itself an act of youth resistance. To speak Nazard is to refuse the language of the authorities. Language is world, is body. And yet, the genre is rarely discussed in terms of its language. Joanna Russ, in How to Suppress Women's Writing, documented this pattern across literary traditions. Entire bodies of work are excluded from serious aesthetic considerations. A woman wrote it, so it isn't really literature. A genre wrote it, so it isn't really literature. In her novel, The Left Hand of Darkness, Ursula K. Le Guin invents the word Schiffgriffon to name a concept from the planet Geffen. It's a very complex concept, of honor and social presence, which the visitor to this planet, generally he doesn't fully understand because he lacks the world the concept comes from. And yet, Astravan from the planet Geffen and generally I find each other anyway, across the untranslatable. Where Burgess shows language as resistance and identity, Le Guin shows it as a medium for what I would call impossible empathy. You know, the ability to stay in relation without fully understanding each other. Karen Tietbeck goes even further. In their novel Amatka, language is existential. Objects must be named regularly or they dissolve into a formless substance. When the protagonist Venya encounters the dissident poetry of Barrel's Anna, she encounters the power of language. The poems weren't just simple marking rhymes or descriptions of the world. Venya had a feeling that the plant houses didn't need marking anymore because Barrel's Anna's words had fixed their shape completely. Whether language is presented as identity, resistance, as the untranslatable, or the condition of reality itself, these works of fiction all point at the same truth. Language is politics. If science fiction is a genre of world-making and reality-changing through language, then queer science fiction is one of its most devoted practices. Queer science fiction rides towards futures for bodies and experiences that the present has no stable language for or actively erases. Sabrina Calvo, one of my favorite queer writers working in French science fiction today, writes about queer bodies. And Calvo's language performs them sentence by sentence. In her award-winning novel Toxoplasma, the protagonist Niki Chanson's body is written like this. Le poumon entre ses cuisses, là où le chaud remue le chaud, où tout s'embrasse, frôlant de l'eau qui bout. Dehors, dedans, et les mailles blancs où glissent ses doigts. The showerhead between her thighs, where warmth stirs warmth, where everything ignites, the purring of boiling water, outside, inside, and the white enamel along which her fingers glide. Fragmentation, rhythm, poetic access, form itself becomes the queer body. Calvo says of her own writing, I am not a linguist. I don't know how to create a world, from its language, real or imaginary, but I can create a language from a dream world. And this language is itself, the queer body. It resists normative expectations. To use language like this belongs to a longer tradition. In the 1960s and 70s, the new wave treated the formal experiment as political intervention. Writers like Joanna Russ, Ursula K. Le Guin, Samuel R. Delany, James Tripty Jr., and many more questioned the default voices of the genre. It is not a coincidence that the writers who pushed furthest were often those with the most at stake: women, queer people, black people. James Tripty Jr., who was also Alice Sheldon, wrote stories in many styles. Some styles passed as masculine. When Tripty's identity was revealed, it demonstrated, that masculine style itself is a construction. In fact, Tripty's style has so many variants, it cannot be reduced just to one thing. Just listen to the sound of a short story. Love is the plan is death. How we blended our singing wordlessly and then with words, until more and more we came to see with each other's eyes, to hear, to taste, to feel the world of each other. Until I became Lily Lou and you became Mogadit, until finally we became together a new thing. Mogadit Lily, Lily Lou Moga, Lily Moga Luli Dit. Le Guin's carrier-back view of fiction argues for new narrative forms. That hold multiplicity rather than hierarchy, relation rather than conquest. Queer science fiction answers to this. As José Esteban Muñoz argues, queerness is not yet here. So if queerness is not yet here, we need, new languages as queer as the futures we desire. Sabrina Calvo and James Tripty Jr. performing bodies into existence through language are practices of this. Science fiction can imagine futures where bodies are livable, bodies which have been made unlivable through racism, transphobia, ableism, anti-Semitism, sexism, classism, and so on. Bodies are a paradoxical place, visible and invisible, tangible and inaccessible, real and imaginary. A space through which other spaces and times become experienceable. So the body really is our first medium for every utopia. Interestingly, in the utopias of the tech oligarchs, the body is something to overcome through technology, something to leave behind for the promise of eternal life or super intelligence. In her famous story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, Le Guin presents us an utopian city where all the prosperity and happiness depend on one child, on one vulnerable body living in absolute misery. Today, the seemingly clean and magical AI we enjoy is trained on data that has been cleaned by so-called ghost workers. Human workers, often from post-colonial countries, whose bodies are forced to witness the horrific content, absorbing the trauma to keep the utopia of commercial systems running. So who gets to have a future? In science fiction, the answer was far too long, the same bodies who own the present. But there was always a counter-tradition. Octavia E. Butler, writing Black Woman into the Far Future. Samuel R. Delany, writing queer Black futures long before we had the vocabulary to name them. A feminist tradition that broke the rules and reinvented the genre. And today we are building new queer feminist traditions, because science fiction, rather than escaping into the future, invents languages for bodies the present cannot yet name. That is survival work. A study published in 2025 found that groups using LLMs came up with very similar ideas. The use of large language models seemed to limit the diversity of their imagination. Another study published in 2025 found that to use large language models, you feel less creative afterwards. But we are in a moment where we need more diverse imagination, more creative thinking to invent and build livable futures on this planet. Many of our past achievements, women's rights, democratic and ecological projects, they would not exist without imagination. Social movements feed on imagined futures and are united by them. A social movement starts in the moment where someone says, I want to turn this imagined future into a reality. Social movements and democracies also run on language, on argument and dissent, on the ability to name things differently when the powerful name them. Hannah Arendt writes that clichés and stock phrases have the socially recognized function of shielding us against reality, against the demands that all events and facts, by virtue of their existence, place on our thinking attention. So what large language models offer is the industrialization of that relief. The antidote for Hannah Arendt is the capacity, to think from someone else's position, to imagine otherwise. Let's imagine otherwise. What would an anti-fascist large language model look like? Maybe it wouldn't be large at all. How about many small language models? Shared like a commons, models, that we can create and take responsibility for. Now imagine this applied to culture. Artists training their own models, experimenting with language and technology, reintroducing diversity and contradiction. Maybe the future of art lies in shaping the systems. Artists shaping the systems and not, producing objects. An anti-fascist language model wouldn't speak for everyone. It would be plural, unfinished. We don't have to look far. Prototypes already exist. In the languages of migration, in sociolects, in dialects, in the many ways people keep hacking language to belong and to survive. Nasba, Kavi shouts. Tell doesn't understand. Vesh sus? Euromish. From every mouth, the mush sounds slightly different. Nasba means the sky has a poor resolution, not much light. That's protosus. Bah, Capitana obvious. This is a dialogue from Proxy. In this novel, I imagined Europe as a city with many slangs and accents and a new language called Euromish, a living language of post-migrations. Researching this, I looked at youth slangs across European countries, and I found something beautiful. Turkish words, Arabic words, Croatian words. Words and phrases are recurring across national lines. The Arabic word yalla, let's go, is used by German teenagers, who've never spoken Arabic at home. And yalla travels even further, from Arabic to Turkish, into German, into Scandinavian language, into French banlieue slang. Sociolect and slangs emerge from contact and use. They are collective and unpredictable. They are already, the languages of many futures. The question is, or science fiction, whether it will be attentive enough to listen, whether it will be open enough to let, these words structure the sentence. Because resistance to technofascism can be linguistic, poetic, rhythms, refusals, the capacity to surprise, to imagine otherwise. Let me propose something that might sound strange. Europe. The European project, what Europe actually is, when you look at it carefully, is itself science fiction. A project of imagined futures. Historically, it's a collection of empires and nation states that spend most of their existence trying to destroy each other. And then, out of the wreckage, something new emerged. European countries began to cooperate with difficulty and many failures. Still, they built institutions that were genuinely new. A court that could hold member states accountable to human rights standards. A parliament elected across national lines. A zone of free movement. A shared space of scientific collaboration. As reported in 2026 by Investigative Journalism, Peter Thiel outlines a theology of the Antichrist in his private lectures. In this Antichrist theology, international cooperation, climate agreements, basic tech regulations, even Europe's AI Act, the world's first attempt to use AI more ethically, are, according to Peter Thiel, early signs of an approaching catastrophe, the apocalypse. Is the European project the Antichrist? Or is it anti-fascist. Eva von Redeker contrasts the fascist urge to destroy with the practice of caring for one another. According to her, anti-fascism means building structures of solidarity, preventing exclusion and strengthening collective resistance. Maybe the EU can become this anti-fascist project. Maybe it is in this sense an utopian project, not yet here. A project that says we are different from each other, we speak different languages, we have different histories, we still sometimes do not trust each other, but we choose to cooperate anyway. Such a project doesn't have, a single language. There is no European language, there is no Euromish. Europe exists only in translation. Every EU Parliament session runs in 24 languages simultaneously. 24, that's a commitment. And every law exists in 24 official versions, each equally valid. That is beautiful. And it's a structural opposite of what large language models are doing to language, turning it into an algorithmic monovoice, a statistical norm weighted towards the already powerful. To translate means to move towards what you do not yet understand, preserving tension and differences, insisting that meaning can survive multiplicity. My grandmother was a translator. By the logic of a country that no longer exists, my grandmother was Croatian, married Serbian, and lived Serbian. We spoke only in French, because I never learned Croatian, Serbian. In fact, my grandparents also talked a lot of French with each other, because my grandpa wanted to learn it more. But to this day, there are many languages in my family and accents, and I do not know all of them. We exist in translation, and that feels European to me, because Europe, for me, is more than geography. It is the idea of coming together in our differences. But it was from the difference between us, not from the affinities and likenesses, but from the difference that love came. And it was itself the bridge, the only bridge across what divided us. This is a quote from probably my most favorite novel by Ursula K. Le Guin, The Left Hand of Darkness. It describes what I would call impossible empathy, the ability to love what we do not understand. And I believe that science fiction is a practice for impossible empathy. And the European Union, in its aspiration as an institution, is maybe built on that ability, to stay in relationship across gaps that cannot be resolved. My grandmother thought that translation is always more. That when you move a text from one language to another, something is added. That the space between languages is always full of possibility, of interpretation, of surprise, of dedication, and of love. The gap between languages, the untranslatable, is also space, where something new can grow. How as a post-migrant, you can carry several gaps, several meanings, several European histories in one body. Europe is also many failures. Wars and conflicts, of what happened to the countries of my parents and grandparents. Europe does not give us tolerance. We still have to do the work of actually tolerating each other. But what if we open these spaces of our imagination a little bit further and try to imagine European science fiction? European science fiction as an utopian project, something not yet here, but worth striving for. An idea, an attitude, an outlook, an ever-expanding pool of differences and cooperation. Because if Europe truly wants to be a project of democracy and human rights, then it should care about the future and the futures of many. When I think of European science fiction, I imagine futures that read and write across languages as a political commitment, a science fiction that exists in translation as its natural form, that builds, it into it. Stanislaw Lem wrote in Polish about the impossibility of genuine contact with alien minds. Early English versions of Solaris were translated from a French text. Angela Carter wrote in English about bodies that refuse their own mythology. As a translator, Angela Carter was famous for creative appropriations, which reflected her own subversive feminist style. Karen Tietbeck imagines language as constitutive for reality. Karen Tietbeck is a writer who themselves translate their work into, from Swedish into English. Sabrina Calvo performs bodies through French language. And these bodies are still looking for their translations. The mere idea of European science fiction can bring these works, into conversation with each other. The mere idea of European science fiction can recognize them as parts of a common project. A project, mediated by lively arguments between readers, translators, writers, between us. How would European science fiction respond to technofascism? How would it engage with the specific experiences of queer European bodies, which is multiple and contradictory? The experience of queer people in Eastern Europe, in the post-Soviet context, where LGBT plus rights movements have a very different history and a very different relationship to Western progressive politics. A European science fiction that genuinely engages with this would be doing something new, emerging different futures from different bodies in different languages. Refusing resolution into a single form or a single voice. That is the condition of possibility. The possibility of many livable futures. What does it look like when a European project decides for many livable futures? In 2022, the European Space Agency selected the first person with a physical disability to train as an astronaut. His name is John McFall. He's British, a Paralympic sprinter who had his right leg amputated after a motorcycle accident at 19. ESA selected him as part of a program explicitly designed to figure out what adaptations would be needed to make space travel more accessible to all kinds of bodies. A program which is so far the world's first and only program to do so. By 2025, ESA concluded there are no technical or medical reasons why McFall could not fly on long-term missions. In other words, they decided that the future is more than the past. That is science fiction made real. And I imagine European science fiction, as the literal equivalent. A project that creates many futures, changes many realities, making room for bodies that have been left out. A practice of caring for one another. A practice of anti-fascism. We are in a moment of danger. These technologies are at work right now without democratic consent, without accountability, technologies that privatize and distort language and then resell it back to us as progress. How do we resist? For institutions, holding that power accountable. How do we resist technofascism? Through practices of care, caring for our futures and for the future of our commons. How do we build a new commons, a European science fiction as multilingual and contested as Europe itself? Something that makes room for all the bodies and voices. This weekend, you will find workshops and panels, working at that. But what does this European science fiction sound like? What are its styles, its rhythms? I don't know. But I want to read it. And I want to write it. I want to find it in your stories, in your poems, translated, mistranslated, always creating something new in the crossing. A commons that lives in the vast space of our differences. Commons made of bridges and translations and love. My Croatian grandmother spoke to me in French, and I am still answering her. Thank you. Thank you.